Welcome to this interview with Doug Pagitt. I'm Jimmy Reeder, a blogger and speaker and founder of Imagine, a learning community working for a better world. Doug Pagitt is the executive director and co-founder of Vote Common Good, an author, pastor, social activist, a leading voice for progressive Christianity. Doug makes frequent national media and speaking appearances and has a new book, Outdoing Jesus, which you can find at his website, dougpagitt.com. Doug calls himself a possibility enthusiast. I kind of like that. For 2 decades, he has been leading the conversation on progressive faith and politics through creative, entrepreneurial, and generative efforts. He works to enlist people to join in the hopes, dreams, and desires that God has for a more beautiful world. So, Doug, I said a little bit about you. Now, you tell us more about yourself, about your work, whatever you'd like us to know.
Yeah, it sounds an awful lot like the text we have written on our website. So thank you, Jimmy, for reading
It
that.
does.
Yeah, I live in Minneapolis. I mean, those things are all true. I run this organization called Vote Common Good. I've been a pastor for all of my adult life. I actually started working at a church when I was, I don't know, 19 years old or something. So I'm 56. So I've been at it for a while here, and spent a lot of time thinking about Christianity and its role in America, what its function ought to be. And the last 5 or 6 years has been a real head spinner in a lot of ways, a real disappointment for me in just thinking about the work that I thought progressive Christianity, especially the progressive evangelical expression of Christianity, could do and could prevent, the things it could prevent from happening, which in my view, the rise of Donald Trump and the rise of the Christian nationalist authoritarian movements that he represents and that seems to support him so strongly. I had hoped, I guess I dreamed, I had guessed that the body politic and the body of Christian faith in the United States would have been strong enough to, healthy enough to sort of expel that virus of Christian nationalism and all that. And it didn't. So I pivoted my life about 5 years ago, and have been working increasingly full time on these kinds of efforts. So nice to be with you today.
I'm glad you're here. So I know on your website you have a whole course on Christian nationalism, but just briefly, how would you describe what it is and the larger movement that it's a part of?
Yeah, Christian nationalism, in my view, has sort of two goals. One is to make the church, Christianity, more nationalistic. That's one goal. And the other is to make the powers and structures of our government more Christian. Now, the people who really want Christian nationalism are doing both of those all the time. Some people, they're just kind of, they just feel, they're Christian nationalist light in their minds, right? They're like, well, this is a Christian nation, so we probably ought to just default to Christianity as the kind of the ethical, moral, religious norm. That's extremely dangerous, actually, both for Christianity and for our nation. My focus in recent years has been more concerned about the impact on our country and less about the impact on churches. I've spent a lot of time, like I said, my adult life being a pastor and thinking a lot about like, hey, how do we make sure that, having too much nationalism doesn't impact and influence our communities of faith? Because it's really damaging to communities of faith. Let's not post the flag there. Let's be careful when we use our Bible passages to be sure we don't sort of conflate the United States of America with the nation of Israel or with the church or something, that kind of work to help churches figure out how to not slip off the path and fall down into this kind of nationalism nonsense. But in recent years, especially with the rise of the Trump administration and the things that I'll just give you a little anecdote, Jimmy. When Jeff Sessions, who was then the Attorney General of the United States, was announcing the Trump administration's choice to use family separation as their response to refugees coming to the United States. And they had a press conference, and Jeff Sessions said in the press conference, I was watching it live. I remember it's one of those moments that, of the last 5 years is still crystallized in my thinking. He said, well, to begin this this conversation about what we're going to do with this separation policy, I want to commend to you the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 13. Yeah. And then quotes it and then says, following the authority of the government is following the authority of God. okay, it's one thing for a pastor to stand up and say that, fair enough. But when the Attorney General of the United States, with the force of law and the force of the federal government, says the rationale for this policy is the book of Romans, chapter 13, under the authority of the Apostle Paul, we have now not flirted with Christian nationalism. It's full on. That's the kind of thing. And that was happening across the Trump administration endlessly. Mike Pompeo, Michael Flynn, Mike Pence, other not Mikes. I mean, they're all doing it. And it was really, it's what caused so many Christians to support Trump. And it's also what's just damaged the credibility of the United States and really, really damaged the country. So anyway, that my concern is more that kind of activity, that too much religion in our government. And I don't mean too much religion in our body politic. I'm not worried about some voter being motivated by their faith. I hope people are motivated by all kinds of things, whether you're motivated by your faith, by your bank account, by the common good, which we'd ask everyone to be motivated by, doesn't really matter. That's not where the threat lies. The threat to the United States and the threat to a democracy lies when the government begins to do its work in order to fulfill its purposes by Christian means or the Christian ends by governmental means. That's where the problem really lies. And the examples are a multitude, which I'm sure you know, and you've done a good job of chronicling here on the website.
Yeah, so much, so much. You know, what you described leads me to what the third question is about, and that is that the movement, I think, is driven by fear, or it uses fear to drive people. Let me say it that way.
That's good.
And what I think what we need is we need hope. That's what we need people to be linked to. So when people begin to learn about this, and they're talking with me about it, the most frequent question I get is, what can we do?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
what do you think people can do to challenge this movement?
Well, first of all, people need to understand what it is, and for a lot of people, they don't know what it is. They just it's really unfamiliar. It's a territory that if you're not in it, it can seem almost hard to imagine that someone is suggesting that the federal government of the United States of America's primary purpose should be to work in the world to bring about the reign of Jesus Christ on the earth. Like, if you're not in that world, you're just thinking to yourself, no one thinks that. Oh,
Right.
oh yeah, they absolutely think it. So having an understanding and recognizing it's a real thing, but then also recognizing that it's not everybody. And there's a real continuum of where people are and the kind of language they use and the kinds of ideas that they hold that don't always hold together in a unified view. So you'll have people that will say things like, well, America's, was founded as a Christian nation and they used the Bible to make the Constitution. Neither of those things are true. But then that's where they leave it. And then they think, but now we should separate out, our religion from our politics, and we should use our religion to motivate people, but we shouldn't ask the government to fulfill it. It's not like they're wrong about the origin story, but they don't really go too far. Other people think differently. So not only should we know about it, but we also, to know about it, we have to know the intricacies and the delicacies of it. It's not as simple as people who are Christian nationalists all think the same thing, want the same goals and ends, or are motivated by the same purposes. There's a whole movement of white nationalism that has blended with Christian nationalism to create a little hybrid white Christian nationalism. They have a really different agenda than a multicultural Christian nationalism for the United States have. And those groups who are all advocating for Christian nationalism actually fight with one another about the way this ought to go. So just knowing that, okay, it's an ecosystem more than a singular belief. So in that ecosystem, you have a lot of features and factors that are at play. And then primarily, here's what I think our response has to be: engagement and empathy.
Yeah.
Now, engagement and empathy doesn't mean step back or lay down and sympathize. Right? Engagement means you have enough of your own sensibility about how you think the world ought to be, because people don't tend to stop believing things. Has been my experience, Jimmy, as a pastor. What people are willing to do is swap one belief for another. And what many of us need is an alternative belief before we let go of a harmful belief. I mean, this is what a lot of work we do, this personal work, a lot of people in spiritual formation, spiritual development with therapists and counselors, like all this kind of stuff. We're doing this all the time, right? You have to swap your belief one for the other. It's sort of like when you're a kid and you're swinging on those monkey bars and you can see that the other monkey bar is whatever 18 inches up and you're not sure your hand can get to it. You're not going to let go of that one until you're pretty sure you can reach that second one. So what people need is an alternative. So engagement is about saying to someone, I have a different way to look at this. Would you mind considering it? Would you mind looking at it? And now not everybody wants to. And then there's empathy. And empathy is to know that people believe things for reasons that make a lot of sense to them. They might not make a lot of sense to you, but the beliefs that I hold, they exist for a reason. And there's kind of three questions we can ask about someone's beliefs, generally, but specifically around this issue. One is, what do you believe? It's a great question. Should ask people, ask them why they believe it. Where did you get that? Who did you hear it from? What supports it? Then there's a third question, which is not as simple just to ask, but it's really important to pursue. And that is the question, what function does that belief have in your life? And that question is more important than what they believe or why they believe it. So when you're dealing with somebody who's holding to Christian nationalist views, you have to recognize that belief is performative in their life. It functions in some way. It does something for them. And until you deal with whatever it's providing for them, you're never going to get any kind of change. Right? This is just true across the board, right? I don't know if you know that meal eating like diet program called Noom. But Noom is a very, very popular diet because it deals with the root relationship that people have to food. But that's how it works. It's a psychological based view. It's really helpful, right? Because you'd realize, oh, midday, I really like to eat sugary, salty, fatty foods, whatever it is. Well, why? Well, because it's doing something in your body. When it hits when it hits your system, chemicals are released, and there's a benefit there. It's not a moral choice or a bad choice or a good choice. It's just a functional choice. So how do you recognize that and then make a change? This is what we have to deal with people. And for a lot of us, we hear ideas like all this. And Jimmy, I mean, I shouldn't project this on others. This is my experience. States, I just roll my eyes and I think, what on earth? How do you even come, right? And once I'm in that disbelief space in my own life, like, oh, I don't even understand what you're. Okay, now you've stepped fully out of empathy, right? So I think it's engagement and empathy and really trying to understand from somebody else's perspective how that belief functions in their life.
Great. A lot of good stuff. You actually, I think, already been answering the next question, but let me say just a little bit and to preface the question, ask the question, and then you can add a little bit more to what you've been saying. Leaders of the broader movement, not just Christian nationalism, but the broader global anti-democratic authoritarian movement.
Yeah.
They've been working 50 years to craft a specific narrative that sounds like common sense. I think that's what you've just been talking about. Sounds like common sense to people who have heard it repeated over and over and over again from the pulpit and all the various places they go for their news. They want people to take back America, return to a time when most of the privilege and power in this country belonged to people like them. But of course, as we know, a lot of people were left out of that kind of world. So I think we need to develop an alternative narrative. That's what you've been talking about, I think. Persuade more people to build the kind of world we want to live with in, and I got it written down there, one of empathy and compassion. So anything else you want to add to what you've already said about how we do that?
Yeah, well, okay, so there's, I feel like there's sort of two sides to this. Again, one is your interpersonal relationships with people in your life. That's some of what I've been talking about, right? Talk family or friends or something. And then there's like the function at the governmental political level. Like say you're talking about a school board and somebody's saying, hey, in this school, at the school board here, we want to make sure that our books that are in the library are only ones that correspond to certain beliefs that are held by a certain subset of Christians. Okay, that's not the same kind of engagement and empathy, right? That's a determination of power and outcome.
Mhm.
That's a different skill set, and that takes a different tack than how do you deal with the people in your life who hold to these views. So helping us understand the difference between what do we do at a city council or a school board or the federal government or electing a president or something. Those are the apparatus that we use to be sure that our systems and structures are in place are different than our personal, interpersonal communication skills. I still think we should bring all of those skills to every human engagement that we have because it's just the better way to do it. But fundamentally, we're making a different set of arguments when it comes to government and school boards or books or libraries or any of this kind of stuff. Um, you have to understand the machinations of those systems and how decisions are going to be made and how you're going to get a certain number of votes and the like, right? So that's a political operation that's super important, and people do really good work on that. There's a lot of people who can do training on that kind of work. The thing that bridges both of those is that as human beings, especially in North America and in the United States, we have this tendency to believe that there's three characters in the story: heroes, villains, and victims. And as it turns out, we always end up as only, two of the three. That's a hero or a victim. Very rarely are we the villains. We can villainize someone else and see how they're the villain. And this story of heroes, villains, and victims is really not serving us well. There's an alternative story, which I'll suggest in a minute. But to recognize that when you're in the hero, villain, victim story, which is the predominant narrative that you see happening all the time, it's how our news gets framed, it's how our sports are done. It's just, this is just the water that we're swimming in, right? It is three elements: heroes, villains, and victims to it. And when you realize that people are almost always posturing themselves as the hero or the victim, it's a different tack for how you engage them. Because if you're thinking you're the villain here, and I want to show you your villainous ways, well, they're not seeing themselves as the villain. They're seeing themselves as the hero or the victim. So now they're reading a part in a script that you're giving them. They're like, this doesn't fit. That doesn't fit my character. My character is that I've been victimized. We're Christians that are being suppressed and we have to bake cakes for people, or that we don't want things should get married or some nonsense like this. Or our kids are being groomed at school for, a sexual future that I don't want them to have, this kind of thing. Or they're like, I'm doing the heroic thing to stand up against the mob and the mass. So when you're dealing with heroes and victim narratives, you have to replace the hero narrative with another hero narrative. What doesn't work, just doesn't function, is to say, let me suggest that you're the villain in this story, right? Okay, so what's the alternative to heroes, villains, and victims? And it's the human sojourn. It's the human migration story. It's that we're all just trying to walk each other home at night. That we want everyone to do better when we all do better. We want to make sure that everyone has enough and no one has to be afraid. It's a shared story by which, in that story, as common sojourners of the human project in the United States, we the people sojourn that we're all on, sometimes we're going to behave in ways that are villainous and sometimes heroic, and sometimes we're going to be hurt and harmed by others, but we're all in this thing together. And we're actually in that space. And when you can get an organization or a school board or a person to agree that that's what we're up to, and to swap the alternative hero, villain, victim story for the human sojourn story, then we're up to something. This is actually one of the places where our immigrant communities can really help us, because if you want to know how do you live in a new land, like if we're sojourning into a new future, in other words, as you said, people are saying things like, 30 years ago or 50 years ago, the world wasn't like this and things have changed and I wanted to go back. That's a classic story of migration, right? You see it in the book of Exodus when the Hebrew peoples are like, let's just go back to slavery. This would be better. Or anyone that's, leaped out, like, maybe I should stop. Maybe I should just go back to where I was. The migrant story helps you realize, no, we're going to find a way to keep moving. We're in a new world. We have new technologies, we have new peoples, we have new languages, we have new understandings, and we have to find a way to live in this new world. So then what we're into is a shared experience where we're all trying to figure out how to live in this new world.
Yeah.
And doesn't mean anything goes. It means, hey, we've got to take care of each other here. So this is, I think, the fundamental narrative shift, because if we just stay in the story of you're villains, and as a hero, I'm going to take back this country from you, and then in some future election, you will take it back from me, and we've got a tug of war with a heave ho going on, just going to wear ourselves out and fall to the ground and collapse. That doesn't match the human experience. It actually doesn't match what anybody's lived life is, or lived experience in the country is. So that's what I think, fundamentally, when we talk about shifting the story, it's even more than just like, hey, be more compassionate, or be compassionate through these mechanisms rather than those mechanisms. It's a deeper change in narrative that says, what are we up to here? What's going on? What is this thing that we're doing on this planet, or with each other, or in this city, or in this town, or on this school board, or in this, like, what are we up to? Like, that's a fundamentally different question, and we don't spend enough time nurturing those accesses to those responses.
Absolutely wonderful stuff there, Doug. You obviously spent a lot of time thinking about these things.
This is what happens when you live on a bus for months and months at a time, and you're talking about this stuff. There's nowhere
well,
to go. It's like your own little prison cell.
I know I'm going to go back and listen to this again. And anyone who's watching this video, I would encourage you to do the same. Go back and take some notes, and then go to votecommongood.org, and maybe you want to engage with the organization that Doug leads. Any one final word for us, Doug, just before we end this interview?
Um, our phrase, to vote common good, people often ask us, well, what is common good then? And we're like, um, common good is not a singular thing, it's an approach.
Mm-hmm.
And the bigger question is not what is common good, but how are you good? And beginning with the assumption you're good and you want to do good.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than making common good be something like, policies or common sense, or something else, it's an approach that says there is goodness, and it can be there for all of us. Like that's the ethos of it. And I feel like that's what the good news, as a Christian, I find good news rooted in that same place. In a civil society, I find the sense of the common space and the common world, and we the people, really important. And so that's fundamentally, I think that's the thing we have to be sure we keep an eye on, is that this is an approach, and not a noun,
Yeah. Well, Doug, thank you for everything that you shared with us today. That's all the time we have today. And I want to thank all of our viewers for being here, and thank you for being with us.
Yeah, right on. Thank you.